Happy Halloween, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay, terrific. Well, happy Halloween. Welcome to the Victorian Archives Centre. If you've been here before, welcome back. Thanks for coming back to our programs and out to North Melbourne. And for those who haven't been here before, welcome. And also a big hello to people tuning in from home, wherever you are in Victoria. We have a large number of people listening online tonight from their couches or kitchens or seance rooms. My name's Kate Zander Zalia Follington, Head of Audience and Online Engagement for Public Record Office Victoria, the State Archives of Victoria. Tonight, we are going to have a chat about the mystics of Melbourne's past. So thanks for giving up collecting candy to join us. I think you've made a wise choice. If you do have a question online, put up your hand through Zoom and we will unmute you so that everyone can hear. And you'll be able to share your question through the speaker system so everyone will hear you. We're going to explore the mystery of the once exotic Eastern Arcade tonight with Dr./Madam Alexandra Roginski and Professor/Psychic Andrew Singleton. Before we start, however, please join me in showing our respect to the traditional owners of the land this event is being held, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and any Aboriginal elders who are here today. We're very fortunate here in Melbourne that we have researchers like Andrew and Alex who are genuinely curious about the less tangible parts of history, how mysticism and spirituality have influenced people in the past, and what that interest may have offered them as a way to navigate the challenges of everyday life, whether it be women of the 19th century or more recently, the youth of Australia. Professor Andrew Singleton is a social researcher. He's interested in youth religion, spirituality, personal beliefs, and alternative religions. He teaches sociology at Deakin University and has co-authored several books about Australian youth, spirituality and society. Alexandra Madam Roginski is an historian, writer and heritage consultant based in Melbourne, and she studies ideas and practices of the body in earlier times. She's the author of 2 books, Science and Power in the 19th Century Tasman World, Popular Phrenology in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Feel free to hold up your book. It's got a great cover. And The Hanged Man and the Body Thief, Finding Lives in a Museum Mystery. So I'm going to hand over now to our special guests, Madam Alexandra Roginski, Andrew Singleton. Thank you so much for being our special guest today. Who's kicking off? Is it? Okay, terrific.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you all for coming to this very special, intimate consultation tonight. I too would like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the country of the Wurundjeri people and that our stories of health and spirituality that we're going to be telling today layer onto histories of place and being sustained by traditional owners from deep time and into today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to any other First Nations people attending today. So, I invite you all to step behind the red curtain and imagine that it is the autumn of 1899 and that over your breakfast in a prim Melbourne suburb, you open the newspaper to read one of these headlines. The tragedy that you and people across the Australian colonies encounter centres on the rivalry festering away among a cluster of stallholders in Melbourne's Eastern Market. The key protagonists are Frank and Annie Cartwright, aka Frank and Annie Stevens. Frank is an actor and also manages a phonograph amusement on the upper flat of the market. She, using the sibilant assumed name of Zinga Lee, reads heads and palms. Their shop front neighbours that of Emery Gordon Madore, also an assumed name, a reader of heads and stars and manipulator of the occult. The Cartwrights and their cluster of associates play pranks on the eccentric Madore, a rivalry referred to by one journalist as the bitter animosity that rages between futurists. Madore is also an alcoholic and, unfortunately for his rivals, mentally addled by late-stage syphilis. Returning to his shop front on a weekday after a massive bender and tipped over the edge by the latest gag played on him, he grabs his revolver and shoots and murders Frank Cartwright and gravely wounds Annie Cartwright before proceeding to attempt to remove Cartwright's head with a knife. It's a very gruesome crime. As the headline, one of the headlines tells us, the unfortunate Barnett Friedman picture frame manufacturer loses an eye while wresting the weapons from the maddened phrenologist. Sensational by any account, the crime rings out from a location with a strong hold on the public imaginary, the Eastern Market. Established in the 1840s to supply fresh food to the eastern part of Melbourne, by the late 19th century, the market provides a space for retail, amusement, and personal services. And the services include the world of wellness and alternative practices. It's a place where stallholders play with ideas of the exotic seen in the outfit and name of Annie Cartwright. And it's also a place frequented by youths and home to at least 5 shooting galleries, to bird sellers and to phrenologists, people who practice the popular science that claims that character and intellect can be judged from the shape of a person's head. Now, on this chart issued by James Shepherd, another resident of the market and an associate of Cartwright, you can see how phrenology divided the head up into a number of different functions. So the idea was that the skull reflected the shape of the brain, and that therefore you could measure someone's head or touch them and you'd get an insight into these specific so-called organs within. So in this close-up, you can see this much talked about organ of amativeness at the base of the skull, which is all about your attraction to others, shall we say. And then you've got philoprogenitiveness, which is the desire to raise children, and so on, in these little kind of vignettes from life. So for a few pennies or shillings, you too could purchase a verbal reading, a marked up chart such as this one, or a fully detailed written assessment for 10 shillings, which was about half the weekly earnings of somebody working in the garment industry at that time, for example. Phrenology was devised at the end of the 18th century, and it really splintered into many different forms. But by this stage, it thrives in markets and arcades, which are semi-public spaces of leisure and some notoriety, where phrenologists such as Madore bundled it with other forms of divination. And if you're after more stuff about arcades, I can highly recommend the work of Nicole Davis and her fashionable promenade blog. It's quite wonderful. But I'm going to give you a brief précis tonight of this part of the city. Thanks, Kate. So in this large eastern block, where I believe there are now various government buildings in the city, you can see it's bounded by Little Collins Street, Exhibition Street and Burke Street. We have the Eastern Market. The phrenologists and diviners used to hang around and rent in this space. And then directly adjacent in this long, narrow street, we have the Eastern Arcade, which was built on the site of the former Haymarket Theatre in the early 1870s. And it was projected to be, you know, space for the sale of fancy goods, confectionery, flowers, and company. And they also said there was going to be a colonial wine shop or two, perhaps a restaurant on a small scale, and one or two photographic establishments. So general space of refreshment and fun and amusement. It was refurbished in 1894 with these so-called Moorish or Orientalist elements introduced, and you can see that in the pointed shape of the archway. So it's playing with this idea of exoticism that was very popular at the time. So in a time when the streets and street life were increasingly regulated, these were spaces of misrule, and particularly the Eastern Arcade. Young people gathered here, including larrikins, and they were seen as sites requiring social control from police and the city council. They were also spaces that can lead us into thinking about forgotten jobs, about women's work, and about opportunities snatched from the margins. By stepping into them, we can reflect on alternative ways of thinking about mind and body at a time, the early 20th century, that bears some similarities to ours in terms of searching and a sense of unrest and people really trying to make sense of this world that they're experiencing. A list of businesses in the Eastern Arcade in 1920 gives us some insight into this world of theatre, wellness, retail, and refreshment. So here's some of the people on the list. We've got costumiers and jewellers, a vaudeville artist, spiritualist, whom Andrew will talk about later, several phrenologists, a herbal repository, trade union officers, a tattooist, a wine salon, music shops, a hairdresser, and an Italian club. We also know that sex workers frequented the arcade in the early 1920s to visit a particular wine saloon, and that several massage therapists treated patients suffering chronic ailments. And this is a time when massage is really coming in from the margins as a successful therapy for treating people with long-term conditions. One job you won't see listed in the directory, though, is fortune teller, and that's because it was illegal, a crime dating back to English statutes of the 16th century, seen as a way to trick people out of money. And the historian Alana Piper has written beautifully about the increased use of these laws in this particular moment when Australia was very early in its nationhood. And there was a great anxiety about the disruption to social order that such subversive work, usually women's work, could cause. Fortune tellers often masked their true work with the label of phrenologist, which they said was a true and objective science. And they brought this up often when they were facing prosecution in lower level courts under the Vagrancy or Police Acts. And it was a knowledge that you could pick up from pamphlets or from attending lectures. And so it was therefore widely available as a form of income, and it gave people flexibility and the ability to run one's own business. In the case of the Eastern Market, just days before the murderous rampage of Mador, the Melbourne City Council had drafted a notice that was to be issued to him and to the Stevenses and others at the market that they were to discontinue foretelling future events, and that this was no longer to be allowed. And if they were not to discontinue this, they were going to have to vacate the stall and would not be able to renew their lease. So we have this sense of constant, imminent disorder about to spill over in these spaces. In 1918, nearly 2 decades after the Eastern Market tragedy, a Russian-Welsh emigre aged in her mid-40s named Julia Gibson, maiden name Glushkova, moved into the arcade, offering services including dressmaking, millinery, ladies and fancy goods, and character reading, which she performed under the name of Madame Gerker. Gerker had been born in the Russian Empire in Odessa and escaped to Wales in her teens, supposedly following some embroilment in revolutionary activity, although the exact details are quite hard to straighten out in her life. Very early in her time at the arcade, police investigated a mysterious complaint from a Mrs. Rachel Tatnall to the police commissioner. And Mrs. Tatnall claimed that her husband had visited Madame Gerker and that she told him things that had upset my happy home. Common refrain in the moral panic about the threat to family life of such practices. The investigating constable, who surmised that no such person as Mrs. Tatnall existed, provided the following overview of Gerker. She lived in Carlton and was married to Henry Gibson, a sword and battle axe juggler, stage name, a Markov of the Russian Secret Service. She had multiple children, with one son who'd been killed at the front and a daughter who served as a Red Cross nurse. And by 1918, she'd already been investigated by the intelligence section of the military authorities regarding her loyalty and national affiliation. Gerker's son by her first husband, Alex Olsen, occupied one of the shop fronts that she leased, and her shop front is here. His is in the foreground, more in this direction, and actually his shingle is in one of your slides, I think, Andrew. So it's a family business, and we know about her through reams of newspaper articles and various legal records. Most infamously, she took a leading role in the investigation of the Gun Alley murder trial, a case emerging from the assault and murder of 12-year-old Alma Tuchka, who had passed through the arcade in the afternoon of 30th of December 1921, and whose body was found in a nearby Gun Alley the following morning. Gerker was part of a clique of local traders and associates who contributed to the conviction and execution of the proprietor of the Colonial Wine Saloon, Colin Campbell Ross, and she shared in the reward. And subsequent inquiries quite recently have shown that he was actually committed on false evidence and was probably an innocent man. Accused of playing the puppet master in a scheme to frame Ross for the murder, she wrote a defensive book detailing her life story and attesting to her innocence, positioning herself as a much maligned and suffering woman entitled to the protection and support of every right-thinking man and woman. Gerker, of course, was far more than a maligned and suffering woman. She supported a whole network of people through her work. She managed residential premises in Rathdown Street, where she leased rooms to people, including Ivy Matthews, who'd been a barmaid at Ross's wine shop and a crucial witness in the trial. She employed a Daisy Crawford to look after her dressmaking business. And in 1922, she also employed a Mrs. Gladys Kerr, who worked for her as a clerk. So she would fill out Gerker's charts when people came in for a character reading. And Gladys Kerr also lived with her in Rathdown Street, as did her son Alec Olsen, a menage detailed and scrutinised in a scandalous divorce suit brought by Gladys Kerr's husband. Gerker was also known for prescribing remedies for the illnesses of a clientele. She sold beauty remedies. In short, she mustered all resources available to her as a migrant and single mother. She used the law frequently to protect her not-so-good name, her autonomy, as well as her businesses. For example, in 1932, she successfully sued for defamation after a middle-class woman, a customer of the evocatively named Rendezvous Cafe, where Gerker offered divination services, supposedly told the owners that Gerker was an abortionist whose, quote, name stinks like a cow's hind leg. She also mobilised the law to shake off her husband, Henry Gibson. In 1918, the year that she ensconced herself in multiple shop fronts in the arcade, Gibson attempted to coerce her to move with him to the country where he could lead a bucolic life more suited to his struggles with the aftermath of malaria. As the Truth newspaper reported, he accosted her in her place of employment, smashed a showcase, and threatened to kill both himself and his wife. Gerker, always up for a challenge, brought civil action against Gibson for the use of threatening action. She said, "I don't want to give up my business, and I have no desire to go to the country with him." The defence barrister rightfully pointed out that Gerker had similarly dispensed with her first husband, the father of Alex Olsen, when he'd become violent, to which she replied, "What does it matter? Even if I had had 20 husbands, I am not to be treated like this." And she succeeded in that, and Henry Gibson was fined £2 and ordered to leave his wife alone. Her many involvements with the law throughout an extensive career, she died in 1953 at the age of 80, are too many to note. And we'll talk about her prosecutions for fortune telling perhaps later on. Yet her story forces us to consider the complexities of this work. These people wove a world of deception, play, and exoticism that both attracted and repulsed people crusading for middle-class morality. And as Chris McConville has written, the early 20th century in Melbourne also hinged on a paradox, a fixation with a perceived rise in criminality that in fact did not match up to declining crime rates. So if we think about the psyche of this time, it was the heyday of the White Australia policy, of fears of degeneracy in the city, and of middle-class concern with the populace. In 1926, the by then notorious Eastern Arcade became Clauskin's furniture store, and the Herald waxed lyrical about the transformation of that unsavoury quarter. Yet these unsavoury people made the most of lives circumscribed by class, gender, and circumstance. Ivy Matthews, barmaid at Colin Ross's wine saloon, said under cross-examination when giving what we now know was false testimony, "A woman can be a good moral woman and still work in a bar." And later on she said, "I do not say I'm a good woman. I'm a woman of the world. Understand that." The phrase, "I'm a woman of the world," stands out to me as the key to understanding the position of the Eastern Arcade and Eastern Market. These sites offered a gateway to a different place that was there to break up the monotony of daily life. These places provided contact with foreignness, a quantity that was desirable and marketable, but also feared. These worlds were not good, but they were deeply, disturbingly thrilling.
The Eastern Arcade, 1922. In this photo, you can see the sign for Mrs. Knight's spiritual meeting shop. Let me tell you about what would happen inside. Her shop is a tranquil oasis from the bustle of the arcade. Inside, heavy drapes over the windows set an intimate mood, with dim gas lamps casting shadows, drawing patrons into the realm of spirit communication. Mrs. Matilda Knight claims she can talk with the dead. She is a spiritualist. Upon entering the shop, the customer is greeted by Mrs. Knight. She's in a tailored skirt, paired with a modest blouse and a string of imitation pearls. Despite her attempt at posh formality, her attire has a worn, slightly threadbare quality. Her face, covered in makeup, hints at her 54 years. Clients, almost all women, frequent Mrs. Knight's establishment for various reasons. Some hope to connect with departed loved ones, like a son lost in the Great War. Others come seeking clarity on personal dilemmas. Mrs. Knight gestures towards a round table draped with a heavy red tablecloth. With a solemn tone, she informs the customer that the reading will cost 2 shillings. The amount is promptly paid. Holding the customer's hand, Mrs. Knight utters a brief prayer and then closes her eyes, seeking to connect mentally with the spirit world. After a moment, she begins describing a spirit that's made itself known. An elder gentleman, she begins, bearded, stern-looking, with glasses perched on his nose. The customer's face shows recognition, confirming it's her late father. Did he suffer from a stomach ailment in his final days, Mrs. Knight asks. The customer shakes her head. No, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. Undeterred, the medium continues, he was a strict man, wasn't he? Receiving a nod in agreement, Mrs. Knight then declares, he's come with a message for you. Mrs. Knight, maintaining her connection with the spirit, begins to relay the message. Oh, I do get a very unsettled state with you. You are worrying. I think you've lost a relative and you will shortly lose another. It's your husband. He is in a bad way. Then you can marry Frank. He thinks a lot of you. The reading extends for another 30 minutes. Once concluded, Mrs. Knight simply smiles, thanks the customer and guides her towards the exit without further ado. Women like Mrs. Knight have been conducting professional readings in Melbourne since the 1870s. They were part of the Spiritualist movement, which had originated in 19th century America and reached Melbourne shortly thereafter. Spiritualism, then as now, asserts that life continues after death and that mediums can communicate with specific dead individuals. Beyond these professional mediums in the late 19th and early 20th century, many spiritually curious Melburnians were part of the vibrant spiritualist scene that included home seances, esoteric lectures, and mediumship development classes. They may have used a talking board like the Ouija board that we've got with us tonight. Some of these experiences were wild and adventurous. In the darkened seance, tables tipped, sometimes levitating or rotating, driven by unseen forces. Some gifted mediums could produce ectoplasm that seemed to ooze from their mouths and other orifices. The year before our reading with Mrs. Knight, some fortunate Melburnians had witnessed Reverend Susan Anna Harris's trumpet seances. Show you a picture of the trumpet seance. It's that silver, thin cone-shaped trumpet. And in the darkened seance room, that would float in the air, seemingly on its own, and produce ethereal voices believed to be the spirits communicating from the other side. Obviously, these events sparked skepticism and very valid accusations of fraud, but other people took spiritualism very seriously. In the early days of the movement, a lot of educated people formed groups to delve into these intriguing phenomena. They viewed it as a science that could empirically prove life after death. Victoria, of course, was home to several such societies, notably the Victorian Association of Progressive Spiritualists, founded in 1870. This society later transformed into the Victorian Association of Spiritualists, and finally in 1931 became the Victorian Spiritualist Union. Still in operation today, just down in Boundary Road in North Melbourne, a welcoming community, and I thank them for the help that they've given me in my research. A young Alfred Deakin, who would later, of course, become Prime Minister, was the Society's second president in the early 1870s. In the 19th century, these associations, inspired by trends overseas, started conducting religious services, complete with spiritualist liturgy, creeds, and hymns. This marked the inception of what we might describe as a spiritualist church movement. So by labelling themselves churches, they hoped to gain recognition as an official and genuine religion. In this photo of the Eastern Arcade, you can spot the sign for the Spiritual Science Hall at the back. It's just underneath the, here I've got a laser pointer. Yeah, it's the Spiritual Science Hall just above the Italian Club. This venue hosted psychic readings during the week by Mrs. Hughes Scott. On Sundays, The Church of Psychology used it for a spiritualist service that featured flower readings. In a flower reading, each person in the congregation brings a flower and the medium holds it and then psychically receives a message that she passes on to the person who brought the flower. For some reason in the present day, this is extremely popular in South Australia, flower readings. High floaters are also popular in South Australia. Mrs. Hughes Scott was the medium of the Church of Psychology and probably the leader and the founder of that church. This church was one of just more than 20 spiritualist churches in Melbourne in the early 1920s. Every week, 20 to 50 people would convene in such venues, exploring their shared philosophy. 2 or 3 mediums would channel spirits from the other side as part of this service, and they would do so from the platform. They were called platform demonstrations. There was intense competition between the churches and many frequently opened and closed. They were volunteer organisations, and so their main income came from the collection plate, which helped cover the cost of the rented halls. And the mediums demonstrating on the platform were both amateurs and professionals. Mrs. Knight demonstrated or claimed to demonstrate at the Association of Professional Spiritualists, the Victorian Association of Spiritualists. Also in the Eastern Arcade was a woman called Mrs. Dooch, who ran a shop and also gave spiritualist readings, and she also demonstrated on the platform in the Victorian Association of Spiritualists. Before the Great War, spiritualism had a few thousand followers in Australia, and Melbourne, of course, marvellous Melbourne, was at its heart. Naturally, the war intensified this interest in spirit communication. Grieving mothers sought to reconnect with lost sons, and spirit communication gained great traction. And it was helped along by several public figures who endorsed the movement. The renowned author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a leading figure in the promotion of spiritualism. The war claimed his son, and after the war, Doyle turned to spiritualism in the hope of contacting him. He penned several books on the topic and he toured extensively. He came to Australia in 1921 to promote the cause. This is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in Melbourne Town Hall, speaking about spiritualism, November 1920. His stops included Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Bendigo, Geelong, and a detour to New Zealand, Aotearoa. By his own tally, and he was very confident in his abilities, he said he spoke to 50,000 people across this tour. Naturally, Melbourne's mediums saw a boom in interest, and it's no surprise that they set up in the Eastern Arcade alongside the Phrenologists and the fortune tellers. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, the number of churches across the country surged spectacularly. And about 6 churches in this time came to buy their own premises. To show you the scale of the movement in the late 1930s, here's a map of Melbourne's churches in 1938. There were 7 message services in the central business district, as you can see in that little breakout box, and others close by in Carlton and Richmond. The VSU was on the edge of downtown Melbourne. Looking at the audience, most of you seem that you've come from the northern suburbs, so you were well represented. Brunswick, Moonee Ponds, Northcote and Preston all had churches, and the southeastern suburbs, St Kilda, Glenhuntly and Prahran. 2 churches in the eastern suburbs were Camberwell and Malvern, and also in the western suburbs in Ascot Vale and my home suburb, Footscray. Now, obviously, this movement had fierce critics. Many argued that mediums like Mrs. Knight exploited people for financial gain. Here at the Public Records Office, there's several letters that have been sent to the police voicing complaints about such individuals. A woman who identified herself only as a sensible mother wrote to police in 1917, "I feel it is my duty to inform you of meetings that take place in Albert Street, Footscray on Sunday afternoons. These so-called spiritualists, it's cruel the way they're leading many of the women folk on about their boys now in France. Of course, they always charge. They quote how everything comes true, and I tell you, it's about time it stopped." Facing concern over their credibility and eager, of course, to gain the right to officiate marriages, spiritualists often approach the government for official recognition. And a notable example is here at the Public Records Office of Victoria. In 1914, the members of the Brunswick Spiritualistic Church, which still operates in the present day in Victoria Street, Brunswick, submitted a petition to the Victorian Parliament. They sought to have their church recognised as a denomination and a religious body to fulfil all related duties. The petition drew the backing of 40 church members and friends, which gives you a sense of the size and scale of these groups. As Alex has pointed out with our phrenologists, women like Mrs. Knight were central to spiritualism. This religion provided women with opportunities to serve as mediums, lecturers, and even ordination as ministers. They often led the churches. Additionally, almost all of the professional readers were women. But because of this, they faced challenges too. State vagrancy laws targeted fortune tellers, making it illegal to charge for their services. From the late 1800s to the early 1950s, many female fortune tellers, including spiritualist mediums, were prosecuted across Australia. And I think Alana Piper's tallied more than 250. It's a really significant number. In September 1922, undercover policewomen conducted raids throughout Melbourne. They first sought a reading from a suspected medium and upon receiving one, arrested her on the spot. Mrs. Matilda Knight was caught up in this sweep, arrested in her shop in Eastern Arcade. She was taken to the City Watch House and bailed for £50. Weeks later, she stood before the City Court with her solicitor by her side as the police presented their case against her. She was convicted of all charges and she was fined £20. And if she failed to pay, she faced a sentence of 3 months imprisonment. Alex, to sort of start off a question time, can I ask you, did some of the women that you've studied face similar problems with prosecution?
They absolutely did. And this is also why, as someone who spent a lot of time researching phrenology, as one does, one of the slippery things about it is that as a term is that because it was legal, people who were doing things that were illegal would say they were phrenologists. So it's also a byword for abortionist, which is why that comes up in that defamation case. And Madame Gerker is part of this cohort with the spiritualists and fortune tellers who are caught up in these purges. And she's attends a meeting, actually, that's reported here. What a coincidence that I happen to have this newspaper article here, Andrew. So there's a meeting of mediums in 1923, and they're talking about going on strike. The leader of this meeting, points out that they're not, practicing witchcraft. They're just freeing themselves from the red tape of the universities. That was one term she used. And then there's this discussion about Madame Gerker's practice, because she's there as well, and that she's getting people to sign a disclaimer form to say it's just an amusement, and she's not really promising to tell fortunes. And Gerker's very offended. But of course, this was quite a regular thing that people who were telling fortunes or reading palms would do to try and prevent prosecution. So basically you'd come in, you'd sign a waiver saying, I know this is just amusement. There's one in South Australia who actually cites the particular piece of legislation, the Amusements Act. And so Gerker had done this. And she supposedly got police immunity at this time. This is not long after the Gun Alley murder trial. But it does get her eventually. So she does end up being convicted. So in between all of her various litigations and things like that, she is also prosecuted, and that's sustained in court, even on appeal. And this is one of the early pathways for women into the police force, actually stinging the fortune tellers. by sitting in and being told about your husband dying so that you can marry Frank and other things, and that being evidence in that case. And I think, as we've talked about a lot, Andrew, it's very gendered. The people who are doing this as spiritualists or phrenologists who are also men are generally not facing the same ire